By August 1941, Japan's military situation looked grim. What started as a border skirmish around Beijing had evolved into full-scale war, draining more and more resources from the empire. Although it was far superior to its Chinese counterpart, the Japanese army had a hard time coping with logistics and was subject to an intense guerrilla war. Even worse, the Allies, unwilling to see Japan threaten their local interests while they were busy dealing with Germany, supplied the United Front with oil and equipment. After opportunistically occupying Vichy Indochina to secure the Chinese supply lines, Japan was placed under a total embargo of its economy by the Western powers, paving the way to further escalation. With a strategic oil reserve halfway to depletion and oil supplies from the USA and Dutch East Indies halted, Japan needed to do something fast. Still nursing wounds after their defeat against the Soviets, the army had decided to join the Navy's doctrine of southern expansion, oil and rubber beckoning them on. In order to cut China from its suppliers, they planned to launch a sudden southern campaign, using the already seized French Indochina as a springboard. With Western colonizers distracted by the war in Europe, it was the perfect moment to seize the resource-rich Southeast Asia. Reluctant to leave an American threat along their flank, and certain that the US would defend the region, Japan started planning an assault upon the islands. The goal: defeat the American forces and occupy the Philippines. The Philippines, today the Republic of the Philippines, is an archipelagic country in Southeast Asia. This island group is the second largest archipelago in the world and comprises more than 7,000 islands extending some 1,850 kilometers from north to south. The two largest islands are Luzon in the north and Mindanao in the south, and these account for more than 67% of the island group's land area. Other large islands include Samar, Negros, Palawan, Panay, Mindoro and Leyte, and the islands lying between Leyte and Mindanao are known collectively as the Visayan Island Group. The terrain of the Philippine Islands Group is based on rugged mountains with some alluvial plains, such as the Central Luzon Plain. The highest elevation is Mount Apo on southern Mindanao at almost 3,000 metres. And there are about 20 active volcanoes. In 1941, some 70% of the island's terrain was forested, with almost jungle conditions in many regions, but there were also some areas of scrub and grassland. Most of the coast is rocky and backed by cliffs, but there are some mangrove swamps and numerous beaches suitable for landing operations. In 1941, the Philippines had a population of 60,770,000. Some 6.5 million lived in the Visayas, almost 1 million on Leyte, and most of the rest on Luzon. The vast majority were Filipinos of Malayan stock with a mixture of Spanish and Chinese blood. They spoke over 65 different but related dialects and languages. Only 27%, mainly on Luzon, spoke English and about 3% spoke Spanish. There were approximately 9,000 Americans residing on Luzon and small numbers on other islands. There were also around 120,000 Chinese and 30,000 Japanese, most of whom lived in the vicinity of Davao in Mindanao. The Philippines was made a United States possession in the late 19th century with the 1896 Treaty of Paris. In 1934, the US Tidings-McDuffie Act established the Philippine Commonwealth. It was an autonomous commonwealth under the protection of the United States, and full independence was promised for the 4th of July 1946. The United States was a power in the Far East because she had taken possession of the Philippines, and was a main reason why the US Navy had developed into an oceanic force. The Japanese plan for the occupation of the Philippines was but part of the larger plan for the Greater East Asia War, in which the Southern Army was to seize Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, while the combined fleet neutralised the US Pacific Fleet. The Southern Expeditionary Army Group was organised on the 6th of November 1941, with General Count Terauchi as Commander-in-Chief. The Nippon Rikugun 14th Army was assigned to the capture of the Philippines, and Terauchi appointed Lieutenant General Homa Masaharu as its commander. Homa, then the Commander-in-Chief in Formosa, had already held combat command in the Second Sino-Japanese War. Specific plans for the seizure of the Philippine Islands were first developed by the Japanese Army's General Staff in the fall of 1941. And by mid-November, Homa, together with the other commanders, both naval and army, were shown these at a series of meetings presided over by Prime Minister Tojo Hideki. For the invasion fleet, the Imperial Navy appointed Vice Admiral Takahashi Ibo, Commander-in-Chief of the Nihon Kaigun 3rd Fleet, to be responsible for naval cover to the landings as well as amphibious operations in the Philippines. Final details were drawn up by Homa and his fellow commanders at a conference in Iwakuni from the 13th to the 15th of November. Both the Army and the Navy reached agreement for the assault on the Philippines under the codename Operation M. Operation M had 3 objectives. First, to prevent the use of the Philippines as an advanced base of operations by American forces. Secondly, to acquire staging areas and supply bases to enhance operations against the Dutch East Indies. And third, to secure the lines of communication between occupied areas in the south and the Japanese home islands. It was also decided that Operation M would have 2 operational phases. For the first phase, there was to be a powerful airstrike aimed at destroying the capability of the Far East Air Force to attack Japanese bases at Formosa or mainland Japan. At the same time, the way would be open for the second phase, that would consist of seaborne landings on the main islands. For this task, the 16th Army was formed from 62,000 troops, divided into 2 divisions and a brigade. With a comparatively small force, Homa was to take on the 10 divisions available to the US Army force in the Far East. Homa was confident, buoyed by his belief in the innate superiority of Japanese forces, and well aware of the lackluster defences that awaited them. For years, the Japanese espionage system had been amassing details of the positions and sizes of the American bases in the Philippines, as well as of the suitability of the islands as a jumping-off grounds for subsequent attack on Borneo and the Dutch East Indies. This bank of knowledge enabled the Air Force strategists to draw up plans to eliminate the US Far East Air Force. However, they were concerned that if the Americans might gain prior warning after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Americans might retreat their aircraft to bases in the south, where they would be beyond the range of Japanese planes. To avoid giving the Americans time to evacuate, the airstrikes against their bases were scheduled to take place on X Day, the first day of the war, as soon as the attack on Pearl Harbor began. But this proved to be impossible, as it was still dark in Formosa for hours after sunrise in Hawaii. Though blood was shed with the Hawaiian sunrise, Formosa was still clad in darkness, forcing the southern thrust to wait 3 hours until dawn could light their strike. Using the intelligence sources, Lieutenant Colonel Sato Tokutaru, Operation Chief of the 14th Army, estimated that the US Far East Air Force had some 200 combat-ready aircraft. Relying on this figure, the Japanese assigned 2 air forces to the Philippines campaign. These were the 5th Air Division of the Army Air Force, commanded by Lieutenant General Obata Hideyoshi, which was to provide 307 first-line aircraft, and the 11th Air Fleet of the Navy Air Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Tsukahara Nishizo, which would supply 440 land-based aircraft, making an overall total of 751 aircraft. This was calculated to give them the 3-to-1 ratio they believed necessary to ensure supremacy over the Americans. By arrangement between the Japanese Army and Navy commanders, the Navy Air Force, whose planes had the longer range, would attack the southern half of Luzon. This included the main air base at Clark Field, the Manila area, and Cavite Naval Air Base and the harbour defence. The Army Air Force would attack the half of Luzon lying north from the Gulf of Lingayen to the west coast. Carrier planes of the Kaigun 4th Carrier Division, consisting of light aircraft carrier Ryujo and its escorts, were to provide air cover for the operations beyond the range of the Japanese land-based aircraft. At the same time, Japanese planners prioritised seizure of airfields to extend the range of its fighters. A small marine unit was tasked with capturing Bataan Island. Its capture would allow the Army Air Force to extend the range of its fighters further over Luzon. Once the Army and Navy Air Force obtained air superiority, the 14th Army would then conduct major amphibious operations in Luzon and Mindanao. These would take place on the 22nd of December in the Gulf of Lingayen. From here, forces advancing down the corridor of the Central Plain would move on to Manila. It was expected that the decisive engagement of the campaign would be fought around Manila. To envelop the defenders, there was to be a second landing on the 24th of December at a point to the east of the coast of Luzon. To protect the flanks of his main force, Oma decided that before they struck, smaller advanced forces should land at Apari and Vigan on the northern coast, followed by landings on the southernmost tip of Luzon in the area of Legazpi. Besides giving flank cover, these landings would serve two other purposes. First, they would divide and draw the defenders away in sufficient numbers to ease the way for the main action. Secondly, extend the Army Air Force bases and aircraft capabilities by seizure of airfields nearby. Once his forces had completed their envelopment and crushed the defenders around Manila, the island fortresses of the bay were to be neutralised and the whole of Luzon occupied. The Imperial General Headquarters and Southern Army expected Homa to complete his mission in about 50 days. It was essential to the General Staff planning that he did, for a large part of his forces were to be used in campaigns beyond the Philippines. The remaining elements of the 14th Army were then to occupy the Visayas and Mindanao as rapidly as possible. Little difficulty was expected in this phase of the operations. Since the archipelago was regarded as an important stepping stone to the Dutch East Indies, plans were at the same time drawn up for the occupation of Davao and Mindanao and the island of Jolo. Both of these invasions would be carried out by elements of the 16th Army, although the date of departure from Palau was set by the 14th Army headquarters. When all these plans had been completed, Homa began to make his disposition within the 14th Army. Lieutenant General Tsushihashi Yutsu's 48th Division was concentrated at Formosa prior to the invasion. The 48th Division lacked combat experience but was regarded as one of the Japanese Army's best formations, and had been specially trained in amphibious operations. The division was therefore assigned the task of making the main landing in Lingayen Gulf on the western side of Luzon Island, after staging from Formosa. A detachment from the 48th Division, consisting of approximately 5,000 troops of the 2nd Formosa Infantry Regiment, was tasked to seize Vigan and Apari prior to the main landing at Lingayen Gulf. The 16th Division, under the command of Lieutenant General Morioka Susumu, was tasked with a landing in Lamon Bay. Staging from the Ryukyu Islands, the division was one of the best divisions still available in the home islands. One of its Palau-based detachments, consisting of 2,500 men of the 2nd Battalions of the 33rd Infantry, were tasked to make an advanced landing in Legazpi prior to the landing in Lamon Bay. The novice Rikugun 65th Independent Mixed Brigade, under Lieutenant General Akari Nara, were to serve as rearguard occupation troops, since many were middle-aged reservists. The troops in this formation were spirited and eager to prove they were as good as the frontline soldiers. The 14th Army also included the 4th Tank Regiment, consisting of 38 light tanks, and the 7th Tank Regiment, with 36 medium tanks and 14 light tanks. The 14th Army support units included 5 field artillery battalions, 5 anti-aircraft artillery battalions, 4 anti-tank companies and 1 mortar battalion. A group of combat engineer and bridging units were included in the 14th Army's support forces. Also included in the army were the 24th Air Regiments, consisting of 36 fighters, which was put directly under the control of Homa. The Nippon Rikugun Air Force contributed the 5th Army Air Force Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Obata Hideyoshi. The division, which was transferred from Manchukuo to Formosa, included the 4th Air Force Brigade, composed of 4 air regiments with a total of 58 light bombers, 11 reconnaissance, 18 heavy bombers and 36 fighters. Also included in the Air Force were the 10th Independent Squadron, with 13 reconnaissance and 10 air cooperation aircraft. These planes would be used on the attack of Apari, Vegan and to support the landing in Lingayen Gulf. The Nihon Kaigun 3rd Fleet was primarily an amphibious force with supporting cruisers and destroyers. Because of the many landings to be made at widely scattered points in the Philippine archipelago, Vice Admiral Takahashi Ibo decided to organise his fleet into numerous special task forces. For the landing on Bataan Island, the 3rd Surprise Attack Force was organised, consisting of 1 destroyer, 4 torpedo boats and other small craft. The naval escort for the landing of the advance units on 3 different points on Luzon consisted of the 1st, 2nd and 4th Surprise Attack Force, each composed of 1 light cruiser, 6 or 7 destroyers, transports and other auxiliary craft. The 4th Surprise Attack Force was to be staged at Palau, and since it could not be supported by the planes of the 11th Air Fleet, it included the South Philippines Covering Force, comprising the 4th Carrier Division with 40 carrier-based aircraft. Also included in this unit were 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser and 7 destroyers. To support the main landings, Vice Admiral Takahashi created the Northern Philippines Covering Force, which he commanded directly, composed of 1 light and 2 heavy cruisers and 2 converted seaplane tenders. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Force provided a valued service to the army early in the campaign. Imperial General HQ planners assigned Vice Admiral Tsukihara Nishizo the 11th Air Fleet for the campaign, consisting of the 21st and 23rd Air Flotillas based in Formosa. The 21st Air Flotilla had 2 Formosa-based air groups with a total of 84 twin-engine, long-range medium bombers. One of its air groups were detached to the Palau Islands with 26 reconnaissance flying boats and 13 fighters. The Navy Air Force's major contribution to the Philippines operation was the 23rd Air Flotilla, that consisted of its fighter forces, made up of 57 long-range fighters. These naval aircraft were tasked to attack targets in central Luzon, including the main Far East Air Force Base at Clarkfield and Manila. Even before the Washington Naval Conference, American planners had developed a plan to deal with the biggest threat to the Philippines. This plan, developed by the US Joint Army and Navy Board in the 1920s and 30s, was to be known as War Plan Orange, one of the many colour plans. Each colour plan dealt with a different situation, with orange covering an emergency in which only the United States and Japan would be involved. This plan had 3 phases in which distance and geography dictated a contest. In Phase 1, Japan would seize the lightly defended American outposts and ensure its self-access to the oil and raw materials of territories to the south and west, while the American soldiers marooned in the Philippines would fight a sacrificial delaying action on fortress positions at the mouth of Manila Bay. The US Navy, concentrated at home ports, would be unable to prevent these takeovers, but could mobilise in the eastern Pacific to Pearl Harbor. The fleet would limit its action to the relatively favourable waters of the Central Pacific, jabbing at fringe outposts and seeking opportunities for battle. After about 6 months, the United States would commence the Phase 2 offensive. The US expeditions, spearheaded by superior naval and air power, would steam westward. Amphibious shock troops supported by this thrust would crunch through Japanese-held islands of the Central Pacific. advanced naval and air bases would be established and supply lines secured. Japan would resist with expendable forces, but the United States would gradually win the attrition war. After 2 or 3 years, it would regain a base in the Philippines. Then, a progressively tightening blockade would sever Japan's vital ocean supply lines. At a time and place of Japan's choosing, the two battle fleets would meet in a cataclysmic gunnery engagement, which American warships would win. After winning the decisive sea engagement, at an unknown time and place, a hugely augmented US Expeditionary Force would launch Phase 3. American forces would advance northward through islands parallel to the coast of Asia to establish new bases for economic warfare. Okinawa's capture would complete the isolation of Japan. Blockade and air bombardment would compel it to surrender in due course, even though its army stood intact in the home islands and in China. The plan was, on the whole, remarkably accurate in its predictions, yet there were significant discrepancies between its premises and the events of the war. In 1935, as the Philippines established a Commonwealth government, President-elect Manuel Quezon asked the United States for help to defend the archipelago. In the summer of 1935, he induced his friend, Major General Douglas MacArthur, then Chief of Staff of the US Army, to become the military advisor to the new government in its effort to organise a national army. For his defence force, he envisaged an army of citizen soldiers based on the Swiss model. They would be backed by a small, regular professional force, which initially would consist of the Philippine Constabulary, an American unit already in the islands. Under this plan, the Commonwealth would, upon full independence in 1946, have some 40 divisions, about 400,000 men, stationed at strategic points throughout the islands. Aiding MacArthur as principal assistants were Major Dwight D. Eisenhower and James B. Ord. In carrying out the task, MacArthur as well as Quezon expected heavy American support. When it became clear this would not be forthcoming on the scale they hoped, and as relationships between Manila and Washington grew strained, in July 1938, MacArthur resigned his American Army commission. However, MacArthur stayed in Manila, continued his role as military advisor to the Commonwealth, and was appointed by President Quezon as Field Marshal in the Philippine Army. The development of the new Philippine Army was slow. By the end of 1939, there were 4,800 officers and 104,000 men in the reserves. From mid-1941, following increased tension between Japan and several other powers, including the United States, Britain and the Netherlands, many Western possessions in Southeast Asia and the Pacific began to prepare for the possibility of war. On the 22nd of July 1941, Roosevelt federalized the Philippine Army, recalled MacArthur to active duty in the US Army as a Major General, and named him commander of the US Army forces in the Far East. MacArthur was promoted to Lieutenant General the following day. Under his new command were the Philippine Division, the harbour defence of Manila and Subic Bays, the Far East Air Force and Philippine armies. The Philippine Division, organised in 1921, was composed mainly of Philippine Scout units, with the 31st Infantry solely American manned, totalling 10,500 troops. Harbour defence of Manila and Subic Bays included 4 US Army and Philippine Scout Coast Artillery and anti-aircraft regiments with 5,300 troops. Under the revised War Plan Orange 3, the mission of the Philippine garrison was to hold the entrance to Manila Bay and deny its use to Japanese naval forces. There was no intention that American troops should fight anywhere but in central Luzon. Bataan was recognised as the key to control of Manila Bay, and it was to be defended to the last extremity. To reinforce the Philippines Division, Philippine Army units were to be mobilised immediately upon the outbreak of the war and would be ready to participate in the defence of Bataan. The Navy was to set up defensive coastal areas at the entrances to Manila and Subic Bays. At the first sign of an attack, a defensive area was to be set up around Manila to control all shipping and a patrol system established for Manila and Subic Bays. MacArthur, however, disliked the negative and defensive approach of these plans and wrote to General George Marshall, Chief of Staff in Washington, suggesting that, with the growing forces at his disposal, the citadel-type defence based on Bataan and Corregidor could be abandoned in favour of a plan aimed at keeping the Japanese out of the Philippines altogether. Better still, if he could, at the same time, increase his air force to adequate strength, he believed he could pose a threat to Japanese sea lanes southward, blocking her movements of raw materials and disrupting her plans for conquest. To build up his force for this task would take 5 months, and he hoped war would be delayed that long. The proposal was approved in August, and on the 14th the War Plans Division of the General Staff submitted a programme for reinforcing the Philippines. General Marshall gave the plan his approval, then notified MacArthur that he would receive 1 Coast Artillery Regiment, 1 battalion of tanks, an ordnance company, and 31 fighters sometime in September, and shortly after that another 50 fighters directly from the factory. At the same time, Major General Henry Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, had proposed 272 heavy bombers, made up of 4 heavy bomber bombardment groups and 260 fighters in 2 pursuit groups, to MacArthur's Far East Air Force. On the 3rd of November, Major General Lewis H. Brereton arrived in Manila to take command of the Far Eastern Air Force. By the end of the first week of December, 10 divisions of the Philippines Army had been mobilised. They included 20,000 regulars and 100,000 totally raw reservists. Their state of training varied wildly from division to division. Some units were below strength, while others were over strength. As far back as September, reinforcements had reached the Philippines too, with the 200th Coast Anti-Aircraft Artillery Regiments and 108 light tanks delivered. For the Air Force, in October, another 9 heavy bombers had landed at Clark Field, followed by 50 fighters. Ultimately, Brereton's operational strength was 35 heavy bombers and 90 fighters. That was about a third of the number MacArthur had requested, but it was all the same formidable forces to him. Under his new plan, MacArthur could use these aircraft to strike at any invasion fleet, or Japanese bases in Formosa. The USA's defence of the Philippine Islands Group was centred on Manila, and included the large air base at Clark Field and smaller bases at Iba, Del Carmen and Nichols Field. A bomber airfield had just been completed at Del Monte on Mindanao. The harbour defences of Manila were centred on Corregidor Island, and there were naval stations at Cavite and Olongapo. By early December, the US Army forces in the Far East had a total strength of 131,000 frontline troops. With MacArthur's army growing and having gained approval of his plan, he now began to organise his forces. His new objective, which was now assigned in Rainbow Plans, was to defend the island entirely. Since Luzon was the biggest island, the main defensive concentration would have to be there. MacArthur divided his forces on Luzon into 2 groups. The larger, called the North Luzon Force, was placed under Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright. His force consisted of 4 infantry divisions, including one of the Philippine Scouts, as well as a 12th Cavalry Philippine Scout. In addition, the 71st Division of the Philippines Army was assigned to him. He was instructed to protect the airfields and prevent hostile landings in his area at all cost. The smaller Luzon forces, the South Luzon Force, was under Brigadier General George M. Parker Jr. and was to cover the lower parts of the island from Batangas to Legazpi. This force consisted of 2 Philippine Army divisions and a battery of field artillery. His objective was the same as the North Luzon Force. The Visayan Mindanao Force under Brigadier General William F. Sharp was charged with the defence of the rest of the archipelago. Under his command were 3 Philippine Army divisions and a battery of artillery. Its primary mission was to protect the airfields to be built in the Visayas, and its secondary mission was to prevent landings of hostile raiding parties. On Luzon, between the North and South Luzon forces, was the reserve area. This area was directly under the control of MacArthur's headquarters and contained 2 infantry divisions, a field artillery unit, and other headquarter units. The defence of the entrance to Manila and Subic Bays were left to Major General George F. Moore's harbour defences, augmented by the Philippine Coast Artillery Command and 4,967 troops assigned to the harbour defences. His objective was to defend 4 fortified islands in Manila Bay and the southern tip of Bataan. Major General Brereton's Far East Air Force was organised into 2 commands. The 5th Bomber Command contained the 19th Bombardment Group with 4 bomb squadrons, and the 5th Interceptor Command, which contained the 24th and 35th Pursuit Groups with a total of 5 squadrons. Brereton also had the 6th Pursuit Squadron organised from the Philippines Army Air Corps with 12 obsolete fighters based in Batangas in South Luzon. US Navy elements in the Philippines were under the Asiatic Fleet, commanded by Admiral Thomas C. Hart. The Asiatic Fleet possessed only 1 heavy cruiser, 2 light cruisers, 13 World War I destroyers, 29 mostly old submarines, 6 gunboats, and Motor Torpedo Squadron 3, consisting of 6 patrol torpedo boats. The Asiatic Fleet also had patrol aircrafts with the Patrol Wing 10 consisting of 24 PPY Catalinas observation aircrafts and 4 seaplane tenders. Under the Naval District were 1,700 Marines of the 4th Marines, recently evacuated from China, and the 1st Separate Marine Battalion. In all, there were about 20,000 American naval personnel in the Philippines. For the Asiatic Fleet, Admiral Thomas C. Hart, who under the existing plan was responsible for the defence of the Philippines, had no delusions about what his small fleet could do. He believed its best hope lay in a delaying action based on Manila Bay while waiting for deliverance by the Pacific Fleet. However, as early as the 20th of November, he had been ordered by Navy Department in Washington to leave Manila and move his ships southwards, where it was believed they would be out of reach of the Japanese, except for the submarines, which were to be used to sink the invasion transports, and some Catalinas needed for reconnaissance. On the outbreak of the war, the only vessels in the bay were 4 destroyers, 6 river gunboats, and 5 minesweepers. There was also the 828 strength of 4th Marine stationed at Olongapo Naval Station, and the 1st Separate Marine with 722 men stationed at Cavite Naval Yard. The Philippines campaign series will continue to unfold. Next, we will dive deep into every battle, starting from the first Japanese airstrike on Davao and ending with the US Army's capitulation in Corregidor. We will see how the campaign progressed, how the Japanese and the Americans executed their respective plans in land, sea and air warfare. If you enjoy this content, please consider subscribing, sharing it with your friends, family and other interested parties. Let us know in the comments your impressions between MacArthur and Halma and who had the upper hand on the eve of the Pacific War. Thanks for watching.